Welcome. We've got a great lineup. The literary agent, Captain Pellegrino, sadly couldn't make it. She got stuck in Paris. I've had that problem myself. However, we have 5 luminaries for you. We have the Penguin Executive Editor, Alexander Ansher. We have the, I've chosen my own editor, I'm sure you guys are going to edit and rearrange later. We chose the inimitable Malorie, the revered Malorie Blackman, and yours is a long adjectival phrase from Talat. And winner of this year's Francis Lincoln Award, the prize for children's writing, Talat. And keeping order and time, the occasionally ruthless, always excellent author Malorie. So we're going to run for around about an hour 10 minutes, both in terms of the debate between the panelists and the talk that we'll give each in turn. And then we're going to shuffle the space, and we'll have the prize ceremony for the Common Word Diversity Writing with Children Award. Just a little word on that one. That's an award that we've developed to try to get more Black and Asian writers and writing for children, because there is a dearth of writing in UK publishing, and also to get other writers to think about how they might write about diversity and engage with that theme, so that we can reflect the UK as it is. Much of publishing, as I see it in children's writing, seems to reflect more the 50s and 60s than the place we live in today. So that's the reason we set up that award. And there are 5 shortlisted candidates here, and we'll talk about more about that a little later. But for now, I'm going to say thank you very, very much for coming. I'm going to hand you over to our chair, Malorie. Thank you.
I forgot I was chairing this. Pete's great, right? Because we came along, Alexander and I came along to an event, I forgot what it was, but it's October last year, at one of the libraries in Manchester, and he told us all this, and he kind of mentioned it, and I said, yeah, no problem. And then he shot me a load of really excited emails about everyone's coming, particularly when he secured Malorie being here. And I hadn't heard from him since, so I didn't think there was something close. But, you know, it's a debate that certainly I have not chaired before, but it's a debate I've taken part in, and what I've sat on many times with Malorie in the past, and with Melvin, I believe, actually, at least a couple of times. So I'm going to sort of kick it off, but the idea of diversity in publishing, and diversity generally, is for me a strange one. I come from the most diverse city in the UK outside London. I'm from Leicester. We don't have a cultural or ethnic majority in Leicester. We're the first properly pluralist city in the UK, according to the figures. So, for me, diversity has always been something that I've been a part of. I am a product of multicultural Britain, if that's what you want to call it. I have no choice. And even if I had a choice, I'd choose to do it if I had to do it again. But diversity is a weird one, so I'm going to kick off with the panel. The thing I want to try and get at is what our concept of diversity is, and what it actually means to each individual member of the panel. And I'm going to kick that off with, because I was so delighted that she got the laureateship, I'm going to kick that question off from Malorie. So Malorie.
Thank you.
Malorie, you were rightly, I mean, in my opinion, given the laureateship, because I think we needed somebody vocal and somebody who's willing to stand up and say what's going on. But the laureateship, when you got it, I remember opening the Daily Mail and reading some of the comments that were written about your race and being disgusted by them. I mean, so in terms of diversity, you're a real face now for writing and fiction in Britain. I don't know whether that's something you wanted to or not, but what does diversity mean to you? And what is diversity? How do we want it?
Well, I mean, diversity for me means a sort of multiplicity of voices, of opinions, when it comes to literature, it's about having the world of literature open to many voices. and from different ethnicities, different genders, different sexual orientations, whatever. And I can only go from my own experience when I was growing up, and that total lack of diversity that was sort of in the books I was reading, because they were very much white middle class. And I loved reading, devoured books, but I was very aware that the experiences I was reading about were not my own. And I longed to see something that reflected the world as I thought I knew it. And so, for me, diversity it is about being able to, on a sort of broader sense for me, it's about having these books that are ethnically diverse, for example, so that we can see the world through the eyes of others. And I think that's incredibly important. I think that books do teach empathy. They do teach you to walk in the shoes of others, and so that you might not necessarily sympathise with their point of view, but you can empathise with it. And we need, God knows we need more of that. And I do feel that it has to be sort of a multi-pronged approach, because it's not just about having more diverse writers, it's about having people working behind the scenes as well, so that the publishing industry becomes more diverse. Again, it's because I know of, I could probably name 2, possibly 3 black editors in this country, and that's it. And so I think it is about having, just opening up that world. And for me, it's about getting into schools and showing, and getting into infant schools and primary schools and showing that there are black writers out there. And my thing, that's why I've always done school visits, and sometimes it's been 2 and 3 a week, and it's been about going into schools and saying, you know what, I ain't all that, so if I can do it, so can you. And putting that message out there, because writing was something that was never, ever offered to me as a careers option, ever. And even though I was writing stories, from the time I was 7 or 8, I was always writing stories and poems, and I would put them in my school books, and my teachers would mark them, etc. And I was very lucky, I had very encouraging English teachers, but not once was that suggested as a career. Because and a lot of people, criticised me for saying this and said, yes, but you kind of put yourself into the books that you're reading. And of course I did. And I became Lucy, who walked through the wardrobe and so on. But at the same time, I was very, but exactly, that's the wonderful thing about books. You can step into any gender, any race, any culture, whatever. But at the same time, I was very aware that Lucy didn't look like me, and none of the characters whose lives I inhabited for a while I was reading the book looked like me, and went through the same experiences. And that's why I think diversity is so important when it comes to literature.
Mel, do you think it's important that young people have characters that they can identify with, whether it's racial, gender, lines, sexuality, or is it more complicated?
It is important. Oddly enough, I had, in a rather different way, a very similar experience, because I don't know, those kind of books that I was reading in the sort of late 50s and early 60s, I don't know whether anyone actually had a life like those kids. The famous 5 with their ginger beer and their cucumber sandwiches and all the rest of it, And it reminds me of the thing Orwell wrote about P.J. Wodehouse, in which he suggested that actually the world of Jeeves and Wooster never actually had existed. It was a kind of sort of golden Edwardian period, and a lot of children's books are like, or were certainly like that, in which it was a kind of golden Edwardian afternoon by the river, wasn't it? Ratty and Malorie and the famous fire and all that, very nice. Within the Willows, I loved Within the Willows. I read quite a lot of Enid Blyton and all the rest of it. But it's certainly true that they were rather escapist types of books. And the whole movement of reflecting actual kids' lives in the books that they read is something really that I think began in the 70s in this country. Jan Needle is what actually a Manchester writer who comes to mind, and there was a group of writers who I think a lot of them were working in secondary modern schools. And
Bernard Ashley.
Bernard Ashley, yeah, there you go. And where are the stories which relate to these kids? So not actually finding yourself in the books that you're reading is actually quite a widespread experience, in various different ways. And I certainly don't remember picking up a book and thinking, oh, this is me, and I recognise myself in this. And certainly there's a very strong movement now amongst writing for children and young people in which you're actually trying to get inside people's heads and inside their lives and inside the environment that they live in and present that to them in that particular way.
Sorry, Malorie was saying she found it difficult to find characters that she could relate to in terms of people that look like her in the literature she read. Is that a similar experience for you, or?
Well, I think it's very similar, but there are other sides to it. Not only I felt that the world I was growing up in, or even the world I'm in, really is effectively fictionally invisible. We don't exist in that, but the fictional visibility is as important as having proper factional visibility for the latter, I think, because it's in that world that, in a sense, we can engage with things that we don't really have any other avenues. And my children were part of the reason I started trying to write. Well, I'm sort of, my children are, I think, a quarter English, a quarter South Indian. I'm Kashmiri, born in Pakistan. I grew up in England. My daughters used to say to me, Dad, how can you call yourself a Muslim? You don't go to mosque. I said, well, I do. It's only when somebody dies. I didn't go on Eid. He said, yes, because you're still going out for a meal with your mates. And you won't let us, you tell us we're Muslims. And I said, well, you are. And I tried to explain non-political things like when I was growing up, we all called ourselves black. We would have gutted to be called black and Asian like we are at the moment. This was a political movement. And I said, well, Muslim is a little bit like that now. It doesn't really matter whether you believe. And she said, well, I refuse to believe in God. And I said, oh, great. So my family now comes up to me and says, well, you've become completely white. What do you mean become completely white? I said, you're so white, your kids don't believe in God. And I said, well, I don't believe. He spent all his life, so we're a complete mess in that sense. And then when we try to do a bit of a religious side, I grew up half Shia. Well, during the month of Muharram. My family, we grew up in Sunnis. And some of the women in the family did the Shia prayer, the husbands did the Sunni prayer. That's before we even got to England. When we got to England, we became a whole series of other complexities. But really, what was said, in a sense, it's not simply on the basis of colour. There's another dimension. We also have a history in class. We have a history of resistance. Now, I grew up fighting tooth and nail the abhorrent aspects of British racism. But I actually started writing in prison. That was the very first time I started working on my novel. But the problem I find is that, look what our children do. My daughters, some of my daughters were hardened demonstrators before they were even born, because we used to drag them out when my wife was pregnant. And I'm sure they walked out shouting slogans. So one of them, certainly, she still does, and it's awful, because she shouts at us all the time. In a sense, she becomes one of the big places where I draw the characters for my children's work at the moment. But then, when the wars are breaking out around us, how can we ignore these wars in children's fiction? Our children are dying.
Do you think we do that?
Absolutely. When do we have children at war fighting against an occupier? Britain is an occupier of our lands today. They are killing people in their tens and thousands. And little boys and girls are going from here over to Afghanistan. It's not far. Especially if you live around, where I live. It's really not far. You can go into Afghanistan and not even know you're there in some cases. And in that sense, it's not just our children that are, by us I also mean British, and it's a contradiction, I know, but children from here are only 16, 17, 18, and they've been given great big guns. They're out in the Kandahar. How can we deal with this? Do we deal with it on some cultural level? Do we say, well, actually, go have a kebab, or go do a bit of rasmalai and samosa, and that resolves our diversity issue? No. Literature must, in my opinion, stand up to the challenges of its time. And the challenges of our time are very straightforward for me. I want to destroy the war machine. I don't simply want to say no. My daughter, I'll give one example and a couple of examples and I'll stop and how this goes. Peter Carlo and myself have told stories to Pete, it's not an exaggeration, in literally tens of thousands of children from here to Lebanon, India, Pakistan. In fact, he's gone into my village as well. And in the process of telling these stories, we deal with the folklore of Africa and Asia, of Britain, and we oppose war. And my daughters went to school to oppose war, and she actually led a demonstration in the playground, about that big, wearing a no-war t-shirt. I think Tony Blair was coming to Manchester in those days. And that school stopped me telling stories. The head teacher said to me, "You're anti-Western." And I got really upset. I am, but I still got upset. I really got upset because I sent my children to a Christian school, and it's ridiculous because I wanted to send them to a school they could walk to. And this teacher says to me, "Tariq, you're anti-Western, and I don't want you to tell stories in the school." And I said, "Oh God," I got really angry. I says, "Mrs. Fitzpatrick, is this a Church of England school?" She said, "Yes." I says, "You follow Jesus Christ?" I said, "Yes." I said, "Jesus stood up against Rome. Rome and Jesus were in slight conflict with each other. Was Rome east or west? I am following the traditions of Jesus Christ." I don't know where I work. I mean, it's in my new novel now, these traditions of Jesus Christ. And she says, "Well, you don't believe in Jesus." I said, "What's that got to do with it?" In one sense, so I'll end up on this, that in a sense, if we stand as writers on the other side of the political spectrum, not only do we have, of course, the commerciality to deal with, which is a very real thing, which I'm sure Penguin can expand on it, we also have the bias of not just the establishment, but the burden of history that we have to contend with at the same time.
Comment on that. Politics of any sort in children's books is a very, very contentious issue, and it is people have dealt with all sorts of different issues, but I think that's the one. That's the one which isn't touched yet, and it's politics in schools. Kids aren't really even taught politics, not in any meaningful sense, not in the sense of this is your life, how are you going to control your life, what do you believe in, how are you going to deal with this, how can you change this. As soon as you bring that into school, then immediately people start thinking that you're being partisan in some way, or prejudiced in some way. If you come out strongly in favour of something, that's like form of prejudice. So, politics is only taught in the most general sense.
But isn't that part of the reason why we have such a surge in dystopian novels now, for example? Yeah. Because I know when I was writing Noble Conflict, that was my anti-war book where I wanted to come out against it. When I wrote Noughts and Crosses, it was about tackling the subject of racism. But you have to do it in such a way where you don't get the instant, "Oh my God, we can't have that," from teachers or librarians or parents and so on. But it's about tackling those things, but finding a way to do it where you kind of get to, where it's kind of accessible and where you don't have people. Because if I wrote a book which was overtly political, talking about the here and now, for example, talking about racism in this country, then I can guarantee you that a lot of people would look at it and say, "Oh, I'm not reading that," or it's not,
Should we get a publisher?
Yeah.
We have Alex, who works for the Penguin. Alex.
I can only really represent myself.
Well, yes, yeah, I was just about to say that Alex is also herself.
Well, she's not a penguin.
One of the things I noticed.
I'm not a penguin.
Well, it's just a little point I want to make. One of the things I noticed last time we were on a panel, and I've been on panels with people from publishing before, is that they tend to get pointed at as publishers rather than human beings. So I was going to mention that. So Alex, on a personal level, do you feel that that's the right way to start? And as an editor, obviously, such a job, do you feel that you'd be happy to see books that like Noughts and Crosses, like Noble Conflict, as opposed to directly sort of in-your-face political?
I would rather do both, because I think the fact that politics isn't actively or as passionately taught in schools as we'd like to see makes it all the more important that we have those types of novels published. because that's a way that children can find out about those views and engage with them and be stimulated by them. If they're not getting it at school, it's all the more important they should be getting it at the library. So I 100% think there's space for novels like that. And I also think it's, in a sense, I don't know how you feel about this, published authors, but perhaps it's sort of, do you feel it's incumbent upon you, once you've got to the place where your writing is really respected and your name is established, that you can actually then be a little bit braver, step outside a bit more from those confines that you may have felt have been on you in the past, and use your voice? I'm not saying you should feel obliged to do that, but I'm hoping that kind of being a respected published writer gives you the freedom to do that, because as an editor, I would 100% welcome those manuscripts landing in my inbox. So I think there is space for that, and it should be out there.
But that leads me to my second
I think
point.
perhaps Malorie raised the point that if you try to write directly on, perhaps you're calling it in your face, maybe an unfair way, a description of it. If you try to grab the bull by the horns and deal with the issues that are, then there are barriers that put up, and perhaps, you know, a point of investigation for the young writers and people in the room, in a sense, is to say, well, how can we overcome the hurdles of today? Because you don't have to constantly harp on about the barriers of yesterday.
But in a sense, are the barriers that were there yesterday still informing the experiences of young people today?
I think those political barriers are very real. I do. And although Alex speaks as an individual, I don't know whether Penguin would be quite so keen if you had some sort of revolution, smash the big corporations down, I mean, it remains to be seen. I certainly haven't ever read one which actually says, politics here and now in this form. And it remains the case that if you start dealing with really active, live issues, then it becomes controversial, and then it becomes in your face, and all those words start coming up against. Teachers are not, they're paid by the state. They're not supposed to be teaching one side or the other. So if you have a passionate political novel which makes a plea for political action, you are going to be in trouble, I would think.
Well, I did it as a non-fiction thing, but it was aimed primarily at teenagers and young adults. It's called Cutting the Crap, and it had one print run. It was never reprinted because most teachers didn't want to know about it. And also, and this is the point I wanted to move on to, is that the bookshops wouldn't stop it. They kept saying,
everybody's wary of it. The bookshops will be wary of it, schools will be wary of it, publishers will be wary of it.
And mine was inherently biased because I made a choice about not holding back on what I thought, because I think, in my personal view, there was too much of that. There's too much of this pussyfooting around,
Yes.
Oh, we must have balance. Well, why should I have balance?
I think, you'd also start coming, there are a lot of pressures in place. I did a sort of a teenage memoir a while ago that I couldn't get published because they were frightened of people being sued both for privacy laws and for libel laws. So I was advised to change sex, gender, hair colour, place. I said, that's a novel. That's not a autobiography. I mean, it's a different thing, but we are hedged around with a lot of pressures to sort of fantasise it. I mean, Malorie makes a very good point about dystopian novels. That's the venue at the moment, talking about issues, but it is quite an indirect way. I think this is something that's in the air. I mean, noble conflict is a very clear political thing. My last book, The Hit, I actually had a revolution in the streets of Manchester. I had been taking over the town hall, and pulling down seats with local government and that sort of thing. I had great pleasure in doing that. I got away with it as well. It's around at the moment, so hopefully you'll find yourself tested when those manuscripts start.
In a sense, it's going to be easier to get away with something that's indirect rather than direct.
Yeah, so for example, I mean, my novel, In My Head, right, was set about 40 years in the future, in which the Tories have been in power for 40 years. So everyone was tearing the place down. But I think when I said that at the launch, the publisher said to me, yes, but we don't actually say that, do we?
Right, which is the next part of this. We know anyone that looks at literature, it doesn't matter whether it's children's, teen, young adult, we know that there isn't enough representation of enough characters from diverse backgrounds. So, Slightly more succinctly, if you could please, all of you. Well, we're going to run out of time with us, and I'd like to get the audience involved. What I'd like to know from you is which single factor do you believe is the biggest barrier to books being published with more diverse characters from more diverse backgrounds? And I'm going to start with Harry.
Industry.
Industry. So the publishing.
Yes.
Okay. Would you like to? Is there a reason why?
You want me to be successful?
Well, no.
Well, I think that
Do you, sorry, actually, let me phrase it another way. Sorry, because do you think that the industry or the barrier in the industry? Do you think that barrier is accidental, or do you think
it's a commercial industry. Nothing happens by accident in the world of commerce. You know, they want to make lolly. We want to tear the world down, in which they want to make lolly. Now we're in contradiction with each other. Writers are born to rebel, and there's something wrong with us as well. You know, I mean, it's something wrong to sit on a chair on your own, you know, talking to characters. And if I must tell you an anecdote, I was born in Peterborough. I'd been teaching my students never ever kill anybody with cancer. So I had a couple of women I needed to kill off, and I'd got rid of one by an accident and one by cancer. And I said, Pete, I can't stand her anymore. I just got to. I'm gonna go slit her throat, maybe throw her off. I was on the bus talking really loudly, and the bus went silent. And it was, you know, the Birchfields Park. I just got off and said, look, I'm a writer, there's a writer at the other end. And the door shut, and they all looked at me as they went past. So in a way, you know, that's the world that we live in. The characters become so real. In the end, I actually got her to slit her throat, not wrist, while feeding the Quran. But the point is that we want to create these worlds. The industry, I met your colleague, you know, and Shannon. She was lovely, and she said great points to me. You know, she read the book, my children's book, and she said, we can't do this one because Penguin is looking for the next Hunger Games. You know, because that's what they're looking for. They're looking for a way of making lots and lots of lolly. When we're writing, we're trying to get steam out. And very often it doesn't marry together. However, you know, that there is no wall strong enough that can't be broken. And yes, the industry has its own restrictions, but the industry is a living organism. It changes all the time. And we're also living organisms as well. We change all the time. Okay. It's a question of where we can marry the two together.
And Malorie, you've been part of this industry for a very long time now. You know,
23 years.
You are now, with your latest role, you know, it's the pinnacle, I guess, in terms of representing children's and young adult writers and poets and illustrators too. We seem to forget about those quite a lot, but across the board. So in our nation, people, if there's a debate tomorrow, there's going to be a debate today because Noel Gallagher said what he said about reading fiction said it was a fucking waste of time. But you can apply that to most of the music he's made since that. But, you know, there are commercial pressures. We regularly sat on panels and talked about diversity. Have you seen any changes? Do you think it's got any better in the last 20
That's an
years?
interesting question. I have seen changes. When I first started, I was told by a number of editors, I was asked by one editor if I'd mind making my characters white. And I said, why? And they said, because we already have a book that features a black family. And I said, but how many books do you have that feature white families? And then it went quiet, and they said, well, would you mind if we made them Asian then? I've had, you know, but all this was when I first started out, and it was the comment, and when I was getting rejection letter after rejection letter, when I was sending my stuff out, I deliberately stopped describing my characters as black. I would describe their hair or whatever, I didn't describe them as black, but I was writing early readers and picture books, so I thought if anyone accepts this, and then I can go in and say I want the characters black. So at least it wouldn't be a kind of instant kind of, oh, we can't do this because the character's black. I got invited in on a picture book and was asked if I could make my character white. This is another editor, and I said no, I want my characters black. And, you know, and it was always this kind of struggle to to get the characters the way I wanted them, because it was seen as other, and this is never going to sell. I had booksellers saying to me, if it's got a black child on it, then no white child is going to want to read it. And I thought, you mean you won't want to read it, not the children? Because my experience has always been children and teenagers will read any book with any character if they're engaged in the story. But it took years to kind of get that idea across. Now, I absolutely agree with Harry. Publishing is a business. They want to make money. When I started, I felt there was more a feeling of if the publishers felt that you had potential, then they would kind of prepare to say, okay, this book maybe doesn't quite hit the mark, but we believe you've got something in you that will get there. I think there's less of that going on now, because with the EPOS system where they get the sales results in 13 weeks, when I first started, it could take 2 years before you got decent sales figures, by which time you could have one or two more books out that were shorter. And so then hopefully it was always sort of a momentum behind it, because then it would wait to see how the next one did. I think there's less of that going on now. If your first book it doesn't make a profit within a year, more books seem to be going out of print. When I started writing, part of the reason I was advised to go into children's writing was because there's longevity in children's books. I think that has now changed. And the advice I would give to anybody who wants to write children's books is actually look at the smaller publishers. Because I think, and this was a shock to me as well, because my instinct when I first started writing was to hit the big boys, like Penguin. And this is before Alex worked there. and then it was always a flat out no. No thank you, no thank you. And I wrote 8 or 9 books, and picture books and early readers and so on. I had 82 rejection letters before anyone said yes. And then, you know, and it was about, my first 3-4 books were all for smaller publishers. My first book that I ever had published was by the Women's Press. Because the smaller ones are the ones who will take a chance. And the bigger ones, like you said, the bigger ones want the next Hunger Games. But you know what? Hunger Games wasn't really big, and you know, it had to come out first and find its own audience. But they want something that they feel is going to be an instant hit, whereas the smaller ones will take a chance on you. So my advice, and it's getting harder as the smaller ones get swallowed up by the bigger publishers, but I would say go to the smaller publishers.
So would you say it's getting, so are you saying the situation is worse?
I would say we have more culturally diverse books in this country than we had when I started. I would say we still have a long, long way to go on this issue. Sorry, that's long-winded.
No, that's fine. No, I didn't mean that. Yeah, that's, I'm just really quite fierce. I've been running teenage panels. I've been putting teenagers on panels and getting audiences of adults to ask them questions for the last 2 years, and you have to be quite harsh with those teenagers. Seriously, I had one girl who started slagging off the adults in the audience. It was really quite funny. I let it go for a while because it was just making me laugh, and then I thought I'm going to have to stop. Alex, modern day decision-making processes about what gets published, are we looking for crap rather than, that's one, instant hit?
Crack in the Irish sense, or crack?
No, cracking it. The instant hit, with the EPOS change. I mean, the EPOS change is basically, as for any of you that didn't get that, it's this idea that, as Malorie said, it would take a while, quite a long while, to know where a book was going, and now that it happens so much, the time is so much shorter, so the decisions are, in a sense, kind of like a football club. Abramovich sacking a manager because he's not won 3 games, that kind of thing, or 7 off.
Tragically, that is true. So, sort of responding from my own point of view, I'm partly with my I was going to say penguin hat, my penguin flippers on. Yes, there is increasing amount of analysis being done in every major publishing house, and it means as an editor, you can't, unfortunately, anymore argue the case of trying to build somebody very, very slowly, maybe slightly unsuccessfully to begin with, over a long period of time. I constantly have that argument in editorial meetings and acquisitions meetings, as do all my editorial colleagues pretty much. But we are a business. We can't publish your books if we're not making money because we won't have the resources to do it. So I'm not embarrassed about the fact that we're a commercial organisation and that all publishers are and have to be, because that's how we get books out there into the shops for kids to buy or into the libraries for them to read. But it does present a very particular challenge. I have to say that's a challenge to authors of all ethnicities. It's not about being black or Asian or anything else. It is just kind of fighting with cold hard data. But, well, Pete handily, I won't use the whole 17 pages of notes that I had last this, but if I could just quickly and succinctly look at the 3 points that Pete kind of answered for us, or pointed us towards answers in his notes for this panel, which was, are the solutions to the lack of diversity in children's publishing A, getting more diverse agents and editors into the industry, B, redoubling efforts to locate and encourage diverse writers, or C, amassing empirical evidence that diversity is what the book buyer market wants? Yes, is a quick answer, all of the above. I think, if you want just a kind of individual editor's take on it, I think it's also partly about stepping out of our comfort zone. We are always looking for the next big thing, but it also only takes one editor and one agent to believe that books about kids boarding school for wizards is the next big thing. You've got a global trend on your hands. So there are...
and bear in mind that when Joanne sent her book out, it was rejected by 9 publishers before it found out.
But I was going to say, and even when it was published, that global trend wasn't spotted by a publisher. It was something that was built in playgrounds and in, libraries. It was a reaction rather than a proactive choice, wasn't it? It wasn't. I mean, the Hunger Games was built.
Yeah.
So the Hunger Games had a massive campaign of money behind it before the books were even finished, the first one. So there was all that stuff going on. It was built. It was basically a phenomenon that was created as a marketing thing. Whereas I guess Harry Potter wasn't. I'm just going to jump to Melvin very quickly. Melvin, Alex made a very interesting point about the fact that, or just a little sort of snippet about, in terms of diversity, I guess it's not just about sort of black people or white people or whatever. Do you think social class might play a big part of diversity? In that if you are a well-to-do Asian comedian or comedian, you probably get your book published. And if you're a working class lad from a Bangladeshi community growing up here in Manchester, the chances are I'm going to
I get it, yeah. Well, sure. I mean, particularly, obviously, if you're a celebrity, publishers are very keen on making large amounts of money, and very particularly the bigger publishers. So of course there are class issues, there are wealth issues. I mean, most of them in the end probably boil down to the commercial issues, I think. And it's of course not a coincidence that the money tends to lie with the majority and with the sort of well-educated majority. I think there are a lot of different processes at work in making it difficult for people, certainly from different ethnic backgrounds, to get published. And one of them, I think, is that although every publisher would love, I think, to have a really sort of large ethnic portfolio, but what they want you to do, of course, is to write for the majority, because that's where the sales are. So if you write a book of, fairy tales or something from your cultural background or from your heritage background, then they're going to say, oh, we're not going to sell many, are we? And so certainly, public probably wouldn't go near it. You might get a small publisher to go near it. And to that extent, the trick is to get published and to do very well. It's somehow to get round that.
But
Malorie's done it enormously cleverly, writing about sort of black kids in a way which is hugely popular amongst kids of all ethnic backgrounds. But it's a very hard trick to pull off.
Yeah, but I think actually there's the game changer for me that I think is on the horizon is the fact that now it is so easy to self-publish. And the fact that you can do this digitally, and Amazon are actively encouraging people to kind of publish their books straight to Amazon, and then your royalties will be higher, etc. Now the problem with that is that then how do you let people know that your book is out there? It's the marketing and the publicity. But if you don't mind spending the money to actually get to do that and have a sort of a press run or get the books out in a limited print run and get the books out to the press and so on. Yeah, it's true. Or you can, or just I couldn't write about an editor. I love having an editor, and I think it's very easy to tell when a book is self-published and it has not gone through an editor, because generally I've tried to read a few self-published books, and the majority of them, quite frankly, I have not been able to finish because they need an editor. But that said, I think that's going to be a game changer in the future, because I think it means then perhaps we will have more diversity in the market if we can sort out if there are editors you can hire and publicists you can hire and marketers you can hire, and so on to publicise your book. Because you could write the best book in the world, no one
It
else
is
about it.
absolutely true. But what we call publishers now might in the future be a collection of agents. One who does your publicity for you, one who does your editing for you, and one who does your sort of art marketing for you, and then, you know, we can get rid of them, sorry.
I'll say,
digitally,
that's something like Malorie. I've never ever written a book, handed it in, and not had it come back in a much better state once I've worked in what my editors
You've
do.
got to have an editor, and you know, when you talk to editors, quite often people who have become very, 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 very successful began their life being practically edited line by line, you know, because
And you learn from it.
you learn from it. So you know,
So-
accepting and finding a good editor to work with the client.
Okay,
Yeah,
so-
you really do need a good editor.
Heading back to the whole promotion of diversity, is that what we need to do? Do we need to find the publishers? Alex, is it the responsibility of publishers to start, and this is from a publishing hat rather than a personal one, is it the responsibility of publishers like Penguin, and you're all Randy Penguins now as well, aren't you, because of Random House, they've kind of joined up a bit at a kind of scale. Is it incumbent upon Random House, Penguin, Scholastic, HarperCollins to go out and actively seek editors, marketing assistants, and for me, the one we haven't mentioned, and incredibly important, sales teams that actually go out and get the book put on shelves. Is it important, and is it incumbent upon, to go out and diversify people working those departments?
It is incumbent upon us. Without me to sound like I'm going to be drum beating for my own employer, Pearson, who are the original parent company of Penguin, the last few years before the recent merger, have got a really active diversity policy, and I hope that will be carried on in our new form after the merger. There's a Pearson senior executive based at our offices in London who is the diversity manager, basically like called Abu Kumara, and he heads up a very proactive approach to recruitment and application of diversity policies in our staff. And I mean, it's still small scale, it just disappointing me, but I have to say it is much, much better than when I first started working in publishing 20 years ago. I've got several black colleagues, many Asian colleagues. I mean, that sounds like special pleading, but it's better than it was 20 years ago.
No, it's true, because I mean, it's the same at Random House. When I've been with them now for 22 years, and when I was first with them, I couldn't see a black face, and now there are plenty of black faces in Random House. I mean, well, plenty. There are more than there used to be, and you know, and in senior positions, etc. But I do feel that's the way to get diversity in books, is to have a more diverse workforce working behind the scenes as well as producing the books as well. That's what's needed, and I think we need to get in at a grassroots level and go into schools and present publishing as a career option that is open to everybody. And part of the problem, I think, with this is that a number of, if you want to go into publishing, it's to begin, when you're at a sort of lower level, like editorial assistant, etc., it's low paid. And a number of people who even make it into editorial assistant roles were interns. Now, I know it's changed recently, but some of the interns I've spoken to over the years have worked in these publishing houses for 3 months, 6 months and longer for free. Now, if you just come out of university and you've got your, mum and dad supporting you, all well and good. If you need to find a job because you've got to pay bills, then there's no way you can work on an internship for free, which is why I agree with this thing about interns should be paid, because then when they are paid, then it opens the door to more people working in these different areas, as opposed to the ones who've got the bank of mum and dad supporting them.
What about the idea of publishers? Because famously, Random House, who obviously I know a lot about as well, because they're my main publisher, they went and brought Tamarind books under their umbrella, something that I know Verna, who started Tamarind, was incredibly happy about, and it's a process she's enjoying, because this is a small print, I'm trying to, how would she describe this?
An imprint.
Kind of I remember her giving a talk one day, and she said, I don't want to call it a black publisher or an ethnic minority publisher. We're a publisher, we just look for different faces. But it came in under the umbrella, and now all the marketing and all the sales and all that support is there. Harry, I know you were talking about commercial pressures, and I know you'd like to quite tear down the commercial aspects of it, certainly what you're saying, but do you think that in the short term, certainly, before any sort of major revolution, it'd be quite nice for publishers to go out, big publishers to go out and start taking some of these small inputs in and giving them just a little bit of a helping hand?
Well, usually when a fish eats other fish and grows big, it's not a good sign for any other little fish to come about. But how many people...
Okay, so I was going to say, in the case of penguin, that's not been the case. I mean, I've been speaking to them recently.
There's always one that escapes the net. Perhaps, how many people in this room are thinking of or are actually writing already with children in mind? Oh, fantastic. Look, one of the great things now is let's move out of England for a little while. In Africa, in Asia, across the Arab world, publishers don't publish, writers publish. Very often. And particularly the poets. You know, they were going around publishing their books, reciting their poems. And this has not just started today, this has been going on for hundreds of years. We defeated many a movement of commerce through the power of the story and through the power embedded within the cultures in which these poems were formed. And they have, you know, people, I don't know whether you've ever heard of poets like Shah Hussain, who wrote 530 odd years ago. And these poems are as alive today as they were then. There were no great printing presses. But what really holds us all together in that sense is the power of the story. And the story is in each and every one of us. That's what makes it remarkable, I think, certainly in looking at the world of children, that we have got such fantastic stories in our houses, in our homes. Now, publishers, you're right.
I was going to say the issue is something like the poetry of Shah Hussain is something that if you know about it, it's fair enough, but most people wouldn't have a clue who that was.
That's why I said let's move out of England for a little while.
Yeah. So I'm saying, in terms of how we do it in the UK, we've got lots of small print presses. There are online publishers, you know, smaller sort of inputs. Is it a good idea for the big publishers like Random House and Penguin to give them a helping hand, maybe bring something in?
Well, I think it's a good idea for the writers to be taken on board. I'm not sure if all the small houses go. The commercial logic doesn't work like that, as you well know. The commercial logic is when the bigger the machine gets, the more vicious it's going to get simply to sustain itself. But that's another issue. The most important thing, all of you who raised your hands, really is get the writing done, get the stories out. And when an idea reaches of its age, it will find its own fertile ground. Nothing stops it, but it must be there in the first place. You must have written, you must produce, and it will find a way. It doesn't matter if you have to stand on a street corner and tell your own story. It really doesn't matter. But if you write them, there certainly will come a time when you will reap the fruits of your labour.
Okay.
Can I echo that actually? Because I used to belong to writing classes, and that's how I kind of started, because I didn't have a clue. And we had writers in there who were brilliant, far better writers than I ever was or ever will be, and they'd get 2 and 3 rejection letters and then they'd disappear. And my advice to anyone who wants to write is do not give up. Do not, if you have a voice, do not give up.
It is a pressure on new writers or writers that haven't yet been published. And I'm going to echo that most of the writers I've met, there are good ones I know that fall at the first hurdle, the second hurdle, the third hurdle, and they give up and they walk away. And you can't do that because the industry is challenging enough. As Melvin said earlier, somebody has to break it. Somebody has to break it. You have to find a way of getting beyond that. So anyway, I'm going to open up to the audience. Has anyone got a question or a comment for the panel? So.
On the one hand, the commercial model, Random House, Penguin. On the other, the struggling individual writer and the developing writer. And in the middle, there seems to be a huge gap that should be filled by what is like the Arts Council in terms of development. And I'm wondering about a conference like this, wouldn't it be useful to keep the commercial model viable, whatever anarchistic and political views you have about it, it has to go and it will trundle onwards. The novice and young writer on the other side, and then in the middle, ideas for development and mentoring in particular, pairing up individual writers who are trying to get manuscripts written and learning a trade in the craft and art with writers who are already published, but finding forms like the Arvin Foundation and so on, opening gaps in those already existing organizations through the Arts Council maybe, or Art Local Development, to get that pairing to happen, using the web as well. But I'm wondering if the development role in the middle should be more aggressively filled for mentoring purposes and so on. And rather than talk at a conference, after the talk, to sit down and do a session where you say, right, here's the Arts Council body, let's say that's the Arts Council, here is the expert mentor, here are the 10, 15 writers who want to be published, who have manuscripts. Before those books become dead books or whatever, they can walk away. Let's create a developmental, active role and forum so that something comes up at the conference and the talk that is a practical thing.
I'll put that Talat, sorry, because is that something Penguin do? So will you Penguin hats on?
With my Penguin on, it's not something that I've personally done since I've been a Penguin, other than my involvement with Common Word, but it is part of
I was going to say,
the processes.
is what we're doing today in the Prize Day Shrine, is it a small example of what can be done?
Absolutely, and I think that is exactly the kind of gap that needs to be filled. I think, unsurprisingly, the problem is funding. I know there are and have been Arts Council funded programmes that do exactly that, and there are a lot of editors in the industry who would be very willing to spend time doing that, so, you know, possibly voluntarily. There's also there are organisations who are making a business out of that now, and so a lot of that time and sort of nous that's available is being sort of sapped up by various academies that have been set up, which people who can afford to can pay on. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but I think there is a space for a publicly funded version of the same thing.
Yeah, I'd love to see a publicly funded version of that, and I agree, you know, when you're trying to get there, the thing which is hardest to get is really good editorial advice, and someone who's going to sort of help you look critically at your work. You mentioned the Arvin Foundation, which is a fantastic thing if you can afford it. I mean,
They do have grants.
they do have grants. I think Malorie and I have done, we're doing another one next year, and you know, I'm a big fan of those. You know, other than that, just go to all the workshops you can. And there are also a lot of places online where you can post your work, and online communities where you can get comments and discussion about your work from other writers.
Those are certainly very popular with the younger writers, not
Yeah.
only in schools,
Yeah.
so teen writers use those regularly.
Can I recommend the City Lit as well?
Sorry.
The City Lit, I spent 6 years there doing various writing
And
classes.
sorry, I know we're just going like this. Also the Scoobies. The Squibbies.
Yes.
The Squibbies is Society of Children's Writers and Illustrators of Britain or something, and you know, they're great. They are for both published and non-published people. They organise retreats,
And they have
organise
regular
workshops,
meetings.
regular meetings, plus you can get a reading circle of people who will sit around and discuss your work. And
Really
it's
well.
highly
Sorry, the general question.
I work for the Arts Council, so I just
Okay.
wanted to say, Fred knows me.
It's quite good that
And
there's
I'm
sort of
good.
halfway between.
So I partly just wanted to say we do fund quite a lot of agencies that absolutely provide that kind of, put writers together, working together. I think we're really conscious that particularly for writers we maybe put more money into younger writers or emerging writers, horrible word, but and maybe we need to think now more also about people who are maybe established but actually want a chance to think, could I do something different, or if I work with somebody, might my work go in a different way? So I think, but we do that through the organisations we fund, like Arvin or the writing agencies, Writers Centre, Norwich, etc. They're all over the country.
Yeah.
I've got a question though, am I
Yes.
allowed to ask it?
Yeah.
I noticed I was really interested in several of the panellists made comments about adults' perceptions of what young people want to read and what young people say about what they want to read. And I noticed recently Book Trust has done a big deal with Kindle for a new prize where the people voting for the winner are the young people reading on Kindle. Now I know Amazon's contentious in lots of ways, but I wondered, do you think having a prize that's driven by the voices of younger readers might start changing people's perceptions about what's popular or what goes down there.
Malorie.
Well, there are a number of prizes that are driven by children already, like the Red House Children's Book Award, the Red House Federation of Children's Book Groups, Children's Book Award. That trips off the tongue, doesn't it? So, you know, and a number of prizes try and ensure that children or teenagers are involved in them in some manner, shape or form. I think it's a good thing. I think actually, part of the reason that Noughts and Crosses was successful in that, you know, that's been my most successful book, was word of mouth. And it is about sort of, and anything that encourages children to read so that, and then spread the word is a good thing. And it's not, I'm not just talking about my books, I'm talking about for everybody's books, for anybody's books. That word of mouth element, you cannot buy, but it's so crucial. And you know, just that thing of having a peer recommend a book, I think it means a lot to them rather than some adult or some librarian recommending a book. I think it holds more store. So yes, I think it is a good thing actually, this new award. I think anything that gets children reading and anything that where they're the main judges and they can take ownership of it. I think that's a really good thing. And to be honest, the prizes for my books that I treasure the most are the ones where the children have been the judges.
I also think it might be, if you are interested in writing for children and particularly teenagers and young adults, if you take a look or try and find, you can find most of them online, the websites for the regional book awards that are chosen and voted for solely by the readers themselves, what you'll find is a massive difference most of the time between the books that win the big national awards for young people and children and what the young people and children themselves actually vote for. There's a huge difference. I just thought I'd throw it in because it's something that's been making me laugh for 30 years I've been doing this. Any other questions? Sorry, I just want to get as many people in as possibly can, so we've got about 5 to 10 minutes, just under 10 minutes.
It's not really a question, it's just more of a comment. Marvin Burgess, at the beginning, earlier on you mentioned something about not every child is represented, sort of doesn't see themselves in every book, because there are books about fantasy, etc., and that doesn't represent every child. I just want to make the point that there's a difference as a black child when you're in a school and having all of these books around you and not seeing a single face that reflects you, and it really does affect you. As a white child, you just take your pick. Do I want to read about being an astronaut? Do I want to read about being an artist? Whereas you don't have that, and we really do need that visibility for black children. We need to have positive images for black children in school. It's just not fair that the only book that I have to give to my sister is Malorie. That's not fair. Why should that be the only book that she has that represents her? And the other thing is as well, when we do have books for children, you know, they're often classed as just ethnic minority. Why are we always put into a box? Why do we not have a normal black version of Tracy Beaker or a black Harry Potter? Why does it have to become a black, not a black, do you know what I mean?
Okay, can I talk to you? Actually, there are other black British writers in this country. People like Catherine Johnson and Benjamin Zephaniah and so on. They are out there, believe me. You do have to look a bit harder for them, but they are out there. I would say, yeah, you're absolutely right, because that's part of the reason I became a writer. The major part of the reason I became a writer is the dearth of books that featured black characters. And I just think that, I absolutely understand what you're saying, and for me it was about, I loved the world of literature, but I was invisible within it. And it absolutely does make a difference. But I think, going back to Melvin's point, I think what he was just saying was that there's, people like working class children, for example, were very rarely, until recently, represented within the world of children's literature. And so what I'm arguing for is more diversity. So if you ask me to name, for example, a book which features the experience of a British Chinese teenager, I'd be hard pressed to think of one. I'd love to read one. I like seeing the world through the eyes of others. And I just think that sometimes you have to convince the gatekeepers, be they editors or booksellers, etc., that actually children love that as well, and teenagers love that. They think, my experience has been, not so much recently, but again when I started and until a few years ago, that they think that, you know, well, why would anyone want to read that? Now, what's interesting to me is, in the world of adult literature, that question never arises. Because otherwise it'd be, so why would we read Steinbeck? And why would we read Chimamanda Adichie, etc.? Where these books are revered in the adult world, but as soon as you talk about diversity in children's books, so there's a lot of people go get all twittery about it. And I just think, and I think, well, okay, we have Asterix, and we have Tintin, and we have the Moomins and so forth, which have been brought into this country in translation, and translated into English, sorry. But we send out a lot of books, but we bring in very few. And I think seeing the world through the eyes of others is what we need. And Elizabeth Laird, for example, writes some fantastic books, because she lived in Ethiopia for a long while. She's a wide author, but she writes about a lot of black African children. And they are brilliant, and they are absolutely brilliant. But what I'm saying is we need more ethnically diverse writers. And so I agree with you on that score. And I think sometimes it's very hard for people who aren't in that position to see that, you know, you do need to see yourself within the world of literature, to feel that it belongs to you, not just you belong in the world, to feel that you are part of that world.
Sorry, do you want to come back in very quickly?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I understand that, and I do think that it is, you know, responsibility of black people or whatever, you know. But I think that that conversation also needs to happen with non-white people, and I think we need to ask ourselves why black people are underrepresented within, you know, the publishing houses and within the books themselves. That needs to be opened up to everybody. It's not always got to be the responsibility of black people to make sure that, you know, because we are writing, you just gained a number of, you know,
I think you touched on a very important point, which is I think that this is a much wider debate than publishing books. I
I had an interesting experience a while ago where I went out to the Congo with Save. Sorry?
That's where I'm from.
Oh, is that where you're from? Yeah. Oh, great. Okay, so I went to Kinshasa with Save the Children, and then I went inland a bit, and they wanted me to. I mean, what I did was sort of collect some stories there, which I'm still collating. But what they wanted me to do was to write a novel, and I sort of was like, well, I've been here a week. You know, I can't write a novel about life in Kinshasa after a week because I'd make a complete fool of myself.
But if you did, you could probably get it published.
I could probably get it published. That's true. I could get it published, but you'd hate it. You hate it. So you know, it is quite a big, you know, quite an issue like that. And, you know, just you can't represent something. You know, there are things that you can do and things that you can't. Like being Australian, you can misrepresent with the best intentions as well. You know, so you know, it was a really tricky one. I don't quite know the way around that, unless it's by sort of collaborations and so forth. Novelists hate collaborations. They hate collaborations. I'd say I've never done it, but I would.
We can take one final question. I think we're going to run out. Is that right? I think we've got. Yeah, okay.
That's not the question. It's an issue that's not being raised. And obviously you guys are there on one side of the fence, and you've got somebody like me who's on the other side of the fence who wants to break in.
So by fence, do you mean published as opposed to unpublished?
Yeah, I'm a self-published writer, looking for an agent to believe in me, and a published house to believe in me. But basically the point I want to make is that you've got people on that side of the fence, and I just want to see if people like Malorie agree with me, that they're quite content in depicting the way black and Asian characters in books, films and games are. Hence why people like me may not need it. So it's a case of, you know, all the channels you see, all the channels that my kids are looking at, Nickelodeon, whatever, they're depicting me and whoever else the way they want us to timeline. But wait a second, no, we don't dress like that. We don't talk like that. Now, do you think that could be a major reason why black and Asian writers are not getting that breakthrough?
The publishers really want you to write for the majority because that's where the sales are. So it is a major issue.
It's the Cosby Show argument from the United States where you
want to sort of depict that Asian character,
or
that just to make the majority happy.
Well, the thing with the Cosby Show was the Cosby Show did well in the States. Anyone that doesn't, I apologise, but it did really, really well. It was the first show with all black cast that did absolutely well because he was effectively a right-wing Republican white man in a black skin.
Yeah.
And that's what it was. So, you know what I'm going to throw that at? I'm going to throw that at the publisher.
Well, you come on something that's a really interesting point for me. One of the challenges that I face as an editor is, obviously I prefer to have a sort of stable of writers from hugely diverse backgrounds, but I also want to have a stable of characters in the books that I publish who come from all different ethnicities. And people are understandably uncomfortable about stepping out of their comfort zone. There's so much to say on this issue. I'm going to try and keep it brief because I know we're short of time. The most important thing, I think, as an editor and as a reader, and as imagine films as writers, is to create characters that readers can emotionally engage with. And if they're convincing characters, then a child from any background can engage with them. And I don't think that that's about... there's two types of writing. There can be characters who are black, but that's not what the story's about. And I think we should have more of those. But also there's sort of books that you can do about where...
Essentially, when I sat down and started writing, I didn't intentionally want to write about Asian and black characters. I wrote about what came from within my own heart and soul. So maybe I've had 2 notes from 2 major publishing houses over the last 2 years.
Yes, but that's only 2. Keep
That's
going,
me.
keep going.
When you get to 50, come back and complain. I'm not going to get involved with that.
But in all seriousness, I would say write what you want to write from the heart, write with passion, write about what your experience is, what you want to do.
Say if I've already done that,
Yeah.
nobody's actually seen it.
But
Now,
maybe
I
that's
come
not...
here with the intention to sort of like be inspired and then inspire others. Now, I want to give Malorie a gift, and I want to give the Penguin editor a gift.
So we're going to, can you just hold on to that? Because we're running out of time, so if you want to do that, you need to do your own time. Okay, sorry, yes, final question.
It's not really a question. I worked at Seven Stories, National Centre for Children's Books, and coordinated the award that Tariq won. And as part of that process, the judging process, we did consider involving children, but decided that we couldn't throw a raft of unedited stories at children. We didn't know the content, we didn't know if they were written for the age that the award was intended for. But as part of ongoing support for Tariq and his novel, what I'm trying to do is, once Tariq is happy with the revision of his work, is to try and get some school children to read his unpublished manuscript. So it seems to me it's a process, it's a journey really, and that you've got to involve children. An aspiring writer has got to involve children in that journey. So try and find some book groups, children's reader groups, and try and find some school librarians who will, talk through the story, the unpublished manuscript with children, and see if it talks to them.
I think I've got to be honest with you, I've been working in schools, I work in nearly 150 schools a year. I think you're going to struggle to go in as an unpublished writer, whether it's either a librarian or a teacher, and especially parents.
I've got a solution.
There is.
I give a solution. It's really simple. It's called bribery. What I did was I got a few girls together because I was writing from 2 girls' points of view. And my good friend Peter Carver at the beginning, he says, Tariq, you're just too violent here, you've got to calm down, you're just always aggressive. I said, you're right, Pete. So I asked my middle daughter to, what did she think, because there's a group of girls. The important point here is to actually involve the core audience, especially children, whoever you can find. And by no means, I go around, round up my friends' kids, I say, oh, a meal in there for you, just come in and slag it off, But what my daughter said, she's very gentle, she wears skeletons now, that glow in the dark, and she goes, Dad, if there was 4 girls coming to beat up that girl, they wouldn't push her, they'd really whack her. And God, we tell you, oh, that's not girls, that's boys. And I was so shocked, and that's what I did actually. I said, why would they do that? And the whole level, what I suddenly learned is that my world and the world of the children that I thought I was writing for were fundamentally different. though that as soon as I realised that actually I was restricting myself, doesn't mean you go for violence necessarily, because it can also be emotional.
I think also, you know, if you look at it, Malorie mentioned them, Melvin mentioned them, I mentioned them earlier. There are online websites like Smasher, that's just one example, where not only can you share work, but what you'll find on there is you'll find dedicated teenage and young adult audiences who are going to be willing to read your work. So that's there. I just think that we're kind of getting away from the point today, which is about diversity. So I want to go back to it. What I'd like to do is very, very briefly now, and I mean very briefly, if there is one thing that you could think of as a panel each that would make a massive difference, just in terms of diversity, what's the one thing that would make the difference, do you feel? I know it's a difficult one to end on, but that's the point.
Big publishers, were more willing to take a long punt every now and again. If they were willing to put, I mean, you know, and Penguin and Puff in particular is after the big bucks these days. You know, more than most of the other big ones. I mean, some of that money could, I mean, small publishers manage to do it. Some of that money, I know this is in any way, sorry, so I'm saying that the moral dynamics here is completely unfair. There's absolutely nothing to do with that. But, you know, the big commercial companies can't, you know, they could actually find the money to make a little space for taking long punts on things and making a little, you know, making opportunities. You know, the Arts Council's been hacked back, everything's been hacked back. I never had any faith in the big society, but, you know, we haven't seen the big companies stepping into the breach, have we? So that would make a big difference.
I would say getting more writers, editors, etc. into secondary schools to present publishing as a career choice for more teenagers and more children, and so that they feel that it is a publishing choice for them, whether they write, whether they want to be editors or whatever, but get them in there and start from that kind of level.
So go into an inner city school somewhere like that, sort of open up the possibilities for you.
Absolutely. I went into a primary school. It was when I had one of my books, Busy Big, was on the television, and I went into a primary school and I was talking to year 5s and 6s, and I sat there and I was talking about Busy Big, and it was weekly on the TV, and this boy put his hand up. He was looking at me really strangely. He said he could put his hand up and he said, "So was Busy Big on the television and then you wrote the book?" And I said, "No, I wrote the book and it was on the television." He said, so you wrote the book? And I said, "Yeah, that's right." And I could see the clogs going around. It was wonderful. And I said, "I wrote the book, and then it was on the television, and I wrote some of the scripts when it was on the television and so on." And I told him, you know, and I was talking about, I went to the National Film and Television School, did my MA in screenwriting, and I got to write the scripts as well, so that's how I did it. And it was like, and I said, exactly, and that's my point, because my point is, I ain't all that, so if I can do it, you can. That's true. God.
I think the change will... I don't think change comes from the top down, it goes from the bottom up. I think that, you know, what we have is you must continue to write, you must continue to value that which is written, and I think there's no wall big enough that will not fall, because already the society in this country has changed and it can never go back.
Okay. Alex,
Yes, all of the above. It is about change from the bottom upwards. It's definitely about outreach. I think that's so important. It's about willingness to take a punt. It's about us as editors, authors, agents, being willing to look outside our own experience and remembering that actually children are colourblind for the most part, in my experience. Can I just very quickly borrow an anecdote from the amazing Verna Wilkins, who Valley referred to before. She once went to sell in her list, her tamarind list, to a bookstore, I think it was in Toronto in Canada. And basically she got the response, unfortunately she does fine, sometimes she certainly did in the past, that, well, thanks, but we don't really need your type of books here because we don't have many ethnic minorities in this part of town. And she looked around, she was in the picture book section, and she looked around at the books all around her, and she said she just held herself back from saying to the bookshelf, "Well, you seem to have an awful lot of dinosaurs living in this part."
Which is, that's the point I'm going to make to close. I just want to thank everyone. So thank Alex, Melvin, Malorie and Tariq as has been my experience every time I've sat on one of these panels or listened to one or been part of one in any way, this is a debate that can go on and on. This is a debate that hasn't, in my opinion, moved on in the 13 years that I've been a writer, because we're still talking about the same issues. The point, I think, that everything that you need to know about this debate, for me, can be summed up in this way. If you are a 9-year-old black child, Asian child, mixed-race child, a child from any kind of non-white background, if you're a working-class white 9-year-old child that lives on an estate in any of our cities in the UK, you have got more chance of reading about dinosaurs and blue rats and watching films about blue rats and pigs and horses than you have of reading about yourself. And I think that says everything that we need to know about the state of the industries at the moment. But that isn't a dig at publishers. I think there's a lot to do, and I think today's debate and the panel has certainly shown that when we think about sort of ways of remedying the situation, we can come up with them. But I want to thank you all for coming along and for getting involved, and I hope it's given you something to go away and chew on as well. Thank you.
Thank you.